She arrived with nothing but a worn bag, a borrowed name, and bruises she'd spent 9 years learning to hide. He was a mountain trapper who hadn't spoken more than 100 words to another living soul in 11 months. They were strangers bound by paperwork and desperation. Two people the world had already finished with. But someone hadn't finished with her yet. And when the snow came down hard enough to bury the cabin to the windowsills, the past rode in right behind it. This is their story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The train was 40 minutes late into Caldwell Station, which gave Thorne Mercer plenty of time to regret the decision he'd made in September. He stood on the platform with his hat pulled low, hands stuffed into the pockets of his canvas coat, watching the other men around him. Two of them were also waiting. He could tell by the way they kept smoothing their collars and checking the station clock. Mail order men. The term sat in his stomach like a bad meal. That's what they were now, all three of them. Men who'd run out of other options and sent money to an agency in St. Louis with a letter describing themselves in the most favorable terms they could manage without outright lying. Thorne's letter had said, established trapper and hunter, 39 years of age, good health, owns property of 400 acres including cabin, outbuildings, and water rights. Seeking capable companion for frontier life. Not a drinking man. Not a cruel one. He hadn't mentioned the 11 months of silence, or the way the cabin felt like a throat that had forgotten how to swallow, or that some mornings he stood at the window watching the ridgeline until the light changed, not because he was looking for anything, just because moving felt like more effort than it was worth. The agency had written back in October. They had a woman, widow, 35. References from a minister and a school teacher. Capable, the letter said, experienced with homestead life. He'd sent the deposit before he could think himself out of it. Now he stood on a frozen platform in December, and the train was grinding its way around the bend at last, steam pouring sideways in the wind, and Thorne realized he had no idea what she looked like. The agency had included no photograph. He was going to have to ask. The passengers came off in clusters. A family with too much luggage, a pair of merchants arguing about something, a young soldier who looked like he hadn't slept since October. Then the platform thinned, and Thorne started to wonder if she'd missed the connection in Denver, and some part of him, the coward part, he admitted, felt something close to relief. Then he saw her. She was the last one off, not because she was slow, because she'd waited until everyone else had gone first. She stood at the top of the steps for just a moment before descending, not hesitating exactly, more like she was reading something, cataloging. Her eyes moved across the platform, the men, the exits, the horses tied at the far rail. She did it in about 3 seconds, and then she came down the steps with her carpet bag in one hand and a small leather satchel across her shoulder. She was middle height, lean in the way that came from real work rather than fashion. Dark hair pulled back under a gray wool hat. A coat that had been good quality once, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Her face was the kind that didn't give things away easily. Not beautiful in any obvious sense, but arranged in a way that made you want to keep looking, trying to read what was underneath. Thorne took his hat off. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Evelyn Hart." She stopped 2 feet in front of him. "You're Mercer." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him the way she'd looked at the platform. Direct, measuring, already cataloging whatever she found useful. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No." She shifted the carpet bag to her other hand. "It's just information." He put his hat back on. "Can I take that bag?" A pause. Half a second, maybe less. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. "I've got it," she said. "All right." He turned toward the street. "Wagons this way. We've got a long ride before dark and the weather's coming in, so we should move." She followed without arguing. That was the first thing he noticed about her. She didn't argue about things that didn't need arguing about. The first hour of this drive was mostly wind. The road north out of Caldwell climbed steadily through scrub pine and frozen grass, the wagon ruts packed hard as iron. Thorne kept the horses to a steady pace, watching the clouds building over the western ridge. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with the carpet bag at her feet and the satchel in her lap, one hand resting on top of it like she was keeping it from going somewhere. He tried conversation once around the 40-minute mark. "How was the train from St. Louis?" "Long," she said. "Stop in Denver?" 4 hours. "Cold there?" cold everywhere. He let it go after that. Not because he was offended, he wasn't. He recognized a person in conservation mode when he saw one, spending energy carefully, like someone who'd learned that running out of it was dangerous. They were another 20 minutes along when the pines got thicker and the road narrowed down to barely 2 wagon widths. A branch cracked somewhere off to the left, ice heavy, loud as a rifle shot in the cold air. Evelyn's whole body went rigid. It was over in less than a second. She caught herself, smoothed her coat, looked straight ahead. But he'd seen it. The way every muscle in her frame had locked up at once, the way her hand had gone white-knuckled on the satchel strap. Thorne kept his eyes on the road. "Just ice," he said, keeping his voice level. "Branches do that when they get loaded up. Happens all winter." A long pause. "I know," she said, quieter than before. "Takes some getting used to," he said. "Even after years up here, I still hear it sometimes and think—" He stopped, shrugged. "Well, doesn't matter. Point is, you get used to it eventually." She didn't respond, but some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders, and he counted that as something. "Boo!" The cabin appeared at dusk, tucked against the south face of a granite ridge with the tree line coming down close on 3 sides. It wasn't pretty. It had never been meant to be. Low roof, heavy logs, shuttered windows, a barn and a smokehouse set back from the main structure, a woodpile that Thorne had been building since September, stacked nearly as tall as the eaves. "Home," he said, pulling the horses up. Evelyn looked at it for a moment. Whatever she thought, she kept it behind her eyes. "Is there a lock on the bedroom?" He blinked. Of all the things he'd expected first. "There's a bolt. Hasn't been tested in a while, but it should work." "All right," she said, and climbed down from the wagon before he could offer a hand. He unhitched the horses while she took her bag inside. When he came in 20 minutes later, stomping mud off his boots at the door, she had already found the kitchen, the wood box, and the lamp oil, and there was a fire going in the stove that hadn't been lit since morning. She was standing at the window over the dry sink, looking out at the last gray light coming down off the ridge. "You found everything," he said. "I looked." He hung his coat on the peg by the door. "I'll make supper. It won't be much. Biscuits and salt pork. I didn't know when exactly you'd arrive, so I didn't—" "I can cook," she said, turning from the window, "if you show me where things are." "You don't have to do that tonight. You just got here." "I want to do something," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not demanding, just steady, that made him step aside and start pointing at cabinets. They ate mostly in silence. The biscuits she made were better than anything he'd managed in recent memory, which he told her, and she said, "They're just biscuits," and ate half of hers. After supper, he showed her the bedroom, his original room, which he'd moved out of in November when the agency confirmed she was coming. He'd put himself in the smaller side room off the kitchen. The main bedroom had the better window and the heavier quilt, and the bolt she'd asked about. "I'll check the bolt," he said, and slid it home. It was stiff, but it worked. "Needs oil, but it'll hold." She stood in the doorway holding her lamp. "Thank you." "If you need anything in the night—" "I won't," she said. Not rudely, just factual. "All right. Sleep well then." He turned to go and she said quietly enough that he almost missed it, "You said you're not a cruel man." He stopped, turned back. She was still in the doorway, lamp in hand, watching him with that same measuring look. "That's what I said," he answered. She held his gaze for a moment longer. "I'm going to be watching to see if that's true." He nodded once. "That's fair," he said. "Watch all you want." She closed the door. He heard the bolt slide home a moment later, and he stood in the hallway for a second before heading back to the kitchen. He sat at the table for a while listening to the wind come down off the ridge. "Just information," she'd said. On the platform, about his height. He thought that was probably the key to something about her, though he wasn't sure what yet. The first week established a rhythm that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with function. Evelyn woke before him, every morning, without exception. By the time he came out of the side room, the stove was lit and water was heating. She would be at the window or by the door, not quite still, never fully at rest, like she was always listening for something just past the edge of hearing. "You don't sleep much," he said on the third morning. "I sleep enough," she said. "What time do you get up?" Before it's light. He poured himself coffee. She'd figured out his coffee on day 2 and sat at the table. Is that by choice? She turned from the window. Does it matter? Not to me, he said. I'm up by 5 usually. I was just wondering if there was something I could... No, she said. There isn't. He drank his coffee. She went back to looking out the window. On the ridge above, a raven was working at something in the pine branches, making a racket. He watched her track it automatically. The sound, then the source, then the assessment, and then let her shoulders settle when she determined it wasn't a threat. He didn't say anything about that. He just filed it away. Boy, she worked hard. That much was clear within the first 3 days. The agency had called her capable, which had sounded like the kind of faint praise that meant ordinary, but capable didn't cover it. She patched a gap in the south wall of the barn that had been letting cold air through all autumn, using a combination of clay, straw, and what appeared to be sheer stubbornness. She sorted through his supply stores with the efficiency of someone who'd done serious inventory before, noting what was there, what was low, what was missing, and produced a written list without being asked that was more organized than anything he'd managed in 3 years. She could read weather. On the 5th day, she came in from checking the horses and said, "Snow by tonight, maybe 6 inches, maybe 10. The horses need extra hay now, and you should bring in wood before noon." He almost told her he knew. 11 years on this mountain, he knew weather. But then he looked north where she was looking and saw the particular color in the clouds, that greenish gray at the edge, and thought, she's right, and she saw it before I did. He brought in wood before noon. She'd already doubled the horses' hay by then. 10 inches fell by morning. She was not easy to be around. That much was also clear within the first week. Not because she was unpleasant, she wasn't, but there was a quality to her attention, always on, always scanning, that made ordinary moments feel like they were being evaluated. When he moved suddenly, she noticed. When he raised his voice, even to call the dogs in from the porch, something in her face shifted by a degree that most people wouldn't catch, that he kept catching. He had to think very carefully, more carefully than he was used to, about things like where he stood in a room, whether he was blocking a doorway, whether he was between her and the exit when he spoke to her. He didn't always get it right. Once, coming in from outside quickly because of the cold, he pushed through the kitchen door fast and she was right there, and the look that crossed her face before she could stop it, "Sorry," he said immediately, stepping back, giving her room. "I didn't see you." She put the cast iron pan she'd picked up back on the stove. Her hand was perfectly steady. "It's your house," she said. "It's not... That's not the point." He kept his voice quiet and stayed near the door. "I moved fast and I startled you, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Something worked behind her eyes. "All right," she said finally. "I'll knock," he said. "From now on, when I'm coming in from outside, I'll knock first." "You don't need to knock at your own door." "I want to," he said. And he meant it, and she seemed to understand that he meant it. And after that, he knocked every single time he came in from outside, and she never told him to stop. The nightmares started on day 4. Or rather, he became aware of them on day 4. They'd probably been happening before. He woke at some point deep in the middle of a cold night to a sound from the main bedroom. Not loud. That was the thing about it. It was a suppressed sound. The kind of noise that happens when someone is trying very hard not to make noise and losing. Brief, constrained, cut off almost before it started. He lay still and listened. Silence came back, then the sound of the bolt sliding and her feet on the floor, and a pause while she probably stood in the darkness collecting herself. He didn't get up. He didn't call through the wall. He understood, with a certainty that surprised him, that the worst thing he could do right now was let her know he'd heard. He lay in the dark and counted his own heartbeats until the floor stopped creaking and the cabin went quiet again. In the morning, she was at the window when he got up, same as always. Nothing in her face to indicate anything had happened. "Sleep well?" he asked, because that was what people asked. "Fine," she said. "Coffee's almost done," she said. He let it go. It was on the 11th day that he saw the bruises. He hadn't been trying to. That was the thing he would think about afterward. how completely accidental it was, and how completely it changed everything he'd been quietly filing away. She'd been fixing the hinge on the barn door, which had pulled loose from the freezing and thawing cycle that plagued everything up here in early winter. He'd come around the corner of the barn to check on her and found her with her coat off despite the cold, sleeves pushed back to her elbows while she worked a stubborn bolt. He stopped. She had her back to him and didn't hear him over the wind. He looked for maybe 3 seconds before he turned around and went back around the corner and stood there in the cold trying to make sure his breathing was normal. What he'd seen, her forearms, bare to the elbow, and on the left arm, from wrist to mid-forearm, a landscape of damage that no single accident explained. Old yellowed marks blurred under newer bruising, still going through its color changes. Shapes that were not random, shapes that repeated. He walked around to the front of the barn and made sure his boots were loud enough to hear coming. When he came around the corner, she'd already pulled her sleeves down, coat back on, working the bolt again like nothing had happened. "How's the hinge?" he said. "The bolt's stripped," she said. "You'll need a new one. I can make do with wire for now." "I've got bolts in the workshop," he said. "I'll get one." He went and got the bolt. When he came back, she was standing with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned toward the ridge. He handed her the bolt and crouched down to hold the hinge plate while she set it. Neither of them said anything about it. But when they went back inside and she asked if he needed help with supper, and he said yes, and she started working at the dry sink, he noticed the particular way she positioned herself, back to the corner, side angle to the door, always with a clear line to the exit. And he thought, not clumsy, not accident-prone, not unlucky. Taut, every bit of it, taut. He didn't ask her about it, not that day, not the next 3 days. He was aware that there were men who would have. Who would have said, "I saw your arms. What happened? You need to tell me. You're in my house, and I deserve to know." He was aware that some version of him, maybe an earlier, less patient version, might have felt that way too. But he thought about the way she'd moved the cast iron pan when he'd come through the door too fast. He thought about the bolt on the bedroom door, which she oiled herself on the 3rd day without asking where the oil was kept. He thought about the way she always knew where every door in a room was before she'd been in the room 60 seconds. This was not a woman who needed to be pushed. This was a woman who had been pushed for a long time, and the thing she needed was the opposite of that. So he said nothing, and he waited. But she started talking on the 14th day. Not about the important things. Not yet. She started with smaller things, which he understood was the only way it was going to go. He was mending a harness by the fire after supper, and she was at the table with a book she'd had in the carpet bag. He hadn't asked what it was. And she said, without looking up, "I grew up in Ohio, near Dayton." He kept working the leather. "What was it like?" "Flat," she said. "Very flat. Good farmland." "You like it?" "As a child. Less so later." A pause. "My father had a wheat farm. I learned to read weather from him." "That explains it," Thorne said. She looked up. "Explains what?" "You called that snow on day 5, 2 hours before it was obvious. I've been up here 11 years, and I missed it for an hour and a half." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. More like the idea of one, testing whether it was safe. "He always said the clouds talk," she said. "You just have to know what words they use." Smart man. "He was," she said, and left it there. But the next night she talked again, a little more, and the night after that. Pieces, like she was handing them over one at a time, watching his face when he received each one before she decided whether to give the next. He tried every time to receive them without reaction, without the thing that made people stop talking, the look of horror or pity or the need to respond when a person just needed you to listen. He didn't always manage it perfectly. He was not a perfect man. Once, when she said something offhand about not having been allowed to keep money of her own, something moved across his face that he didn't catch in time. She stopped mid-sentence. "Sorry," he said. "Keep going." "You made a face." "I know, I'm sorry, I'm not—" "It wasn't judgment. Keep going." She studied him. "What was it then?" "Anger," he said. "Not at you." A long silence. The fire popped. Outside, the wind lifted and settled. "All right," she said, and kept talking. On the 19th night, she told him about her husband. Not all of it, not the details, those came later, but the shape of it. His name had been Gerald Hart. She'd married him at 26, which had seemed practical at the time. He was established, older, respected in their community. Her father had approved. The minister had performed the service on a Tuesday in spring, and within 6 months she understood she had made a catastrophic mistake. He wasn't a violent man at first, she said. She was sitting at the table, both hands around her coffee cup, looking at the grain of the wood rather than at Thorne. That's what I keep. That's what I think about. That first year wasn't what the rest of them were. So by the time it became what it became, I'd already arranged my whole life around staying. The community knew, Thorne said, quietly. The community, she said carefully, had decided that a woman who found herself in difficulty had probably contributed to it somehow. Thorne said nothing. He kept his hands still on the table. His brother Silas was on the church council, she said. There were other men, prominent men, who were part of that same council. Gerald was careful about who saw what, and I was... She stopped, started again. I got good at covering it. You get good at it. It becomes another skill like anything else. Which hat covers what? Which sleeve stays down? Who was the minister? He asked. The one who married you. Was he on the council too? No, she said. The minister was an old man who I think genuinely didn't know. He's dead now. A pause. Gerald's dead too. 2 years ago, this January, his heart gave out at 51, which the council called a tragedy. And you? She looked up. I called it an open door, she said flatly. The first one I'd had in 9 years. He held her gaze. Good, he said. Something in her face shifted. Sharp surprise, brief and unguarded, before the careful expression came back. She hadn't expected that, he could tell. Good, she said. The door opened, he said. You walked through it. You're here. That's a good thing. That's not a complicated thing. She looked at him for a long time. You're a strange man, Thorne Mercer, she said finally. Probably, he agreed. Do you want more coffee? She blinked at the change of subject. Yes, she said, and slid her cup across the table. On the 23rd day it snowed again, not the warning sign storm she'd predicted on day 5. This was the real thing. This was the mountain deciding it had been patient long enough. It started in the early morning, innocent looking, just a few flakes drifting past the window while they ate breakfast. By noon the wind had turned serious. By mid-afternoon the drifts were coming up over the porch rail and the sky had gone the color of old iron, and the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. Thorne brought in every piece of wood he could carry in 3 trips, then did the horses, then checked every latch on every outbuilding and came back in covered in snow and unable to feel his ears. Evelyn was at the stove when he came in. He knocked. She called out that it was fine before he'd finished knocking, and she had soup going and the lamp lit, and she looked at his ears and said, "Sit," the way she might say it to one of the dogs. He sat. She put a cloth soaked in cold water against his ear, which stung badly enough that he said something under his breath that he immediately regretted. Language, she said. I'm sorry. I've heard worse. She moved to the other ear. You went out without a scarf. I forgot. How does someone forget a scarf in December? I was in a hurry. You're always in a hurry when you go outside, she said, working at his ear matter-of-factly, standing close enough that he could smell the soap she used. I've noticed you don't layer properly either. You wear enough for a cold day, not enough for a bad one. You've been monitoring my outerwear, he said. Someone has to. She stepped back and checked his ears. They'll be fine. Don't go back out tonight. I won't, he said. And then, because it surprised him, and he said things when they surprised him. Thank you. She looked at him. She seemed to find it odd that he'd thanked her. Then she turned back to the soup and said, It needs another 20 minutes. The storm built through the evening, louder and more forceful, until it was a constant low roar against the shutters. The temperature dropped inside despite the stove's best efforts, and they ended up both at the kitchen table, closer to the stove than any other arrangement, with the oil lamp between them. It was in this arrangement, forced proximity, nowhere else to go, the storm making privacy seem beside the point, that Evelyn opened the carpet bag. Thorne had never seen her do this. The bag sat at the foot of her bed every night. She carried the satchel during the day, but the carpet bag was another matter. She moved it, she kept track of it, she never set it more than arm's reach away. She opened it now and took out a bundled leather packet that had been sewn into the lining with a kind of rough, purposeful needlework, not made to look like part of the bag, but to hide inside it. She put the packet on the table between them. "There's something you need to know," she said. He looked at the packet, then at her. "All right." "I didn't come here only to get away from what it was," she said. She was holding herself very still. "I came here because someone is going to try to find me. And you should know that before it happens rather than after." He was quiet for a moment. The storm pushed against the south wall. "Tell me," he said. She talked for a long time. Her husband Gerald had owned land in addition to the house in town, 160 acres of river-bottom ground that he'd acquired before their marriage. Under the terms he'd made, which she had managed to have reviewed by an attorney in Denver 3 months after Gerald's death, the land transferred to her outright upon his death. The attorney had confirmed it. She'd seen it in writing, but Gerald's brother Silas hadn't agreed with that interpretation. "It's good land," Evelyn said. "That's the thing about it. It's not symbolic. It's not a matter of principle to him. It's just valuable land in a good location, and he wants it. River bottom ground in that part of the country goes for 3 times what hill ground does, maybe more." What's Silas's argument? That Gerald was not in his right mind when the original agreement was written. That I manipulated a vulnerable man. She said it flatly, without heat, like she'd already processed the outrage of it and moved past to pure clarity. He has 2 men on the church council who have agreed to provide statements supporting this. "Supporting something they have no evidence for," Thorne said. "Men like Silas don't need evidence," she said. "They need other men to agree with them, that's all. And most men do." "What's in the packet?" She untied it. Inside, papers folded and refolded. Deeds, letters in different handwritings, official documents with stamps and notary seals. She laid them out on the table one by one, careful as a card player showing a hand. "Property records with my name," she said. "The attorney's written opinion. 3 letters from Silas to Gerald that I found in Gerald's desk after he died. They discuss the land specifically. They discuss what Silas expected to receive upon Gerald's death." She paused. "And this." The last document was single-sheeted, folded twice. She set it in front of him. He picked it up. He read it. It was a physician's statement, dated 14 months ago, the signature that of a Dr. Adolphus Crane in Denver, describing in precise clinical language the injuries present on Evelyn Hart's body at the time of an examination she'd requested 6 months after Gerald's death. The language was technical and exact. It described the nature of the markings, their pattern, their apparent age, and the physician's professional conclusion as to their likely cause. He read it twice. He put it down. He kept his face as controlled as he possibly could, and he said quietly, "You carried this all the way here." "I carry it everywhere," she said. "If Silas challenges me in court, all of this goes into the record. Everything. His letters, the physician's statement. Everything that Gerald and Silas and the council worked very hard to make sure never saw daylight." "He knows this?" "He will," she said. "Eventually. Either someone will tell him where I've gone, or he'll find out through the agency. I don't know how long I have." She looked at the documents on the table. "But I wanted you to know. You offered me a home and you didn't know what you were taking on. That's not fair to you." "I appreciate you telling me," he said. She looked at him sharply. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles for me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't need rescuing. I need you to know what's coming." "I know," he said. "Do you? You just spent 20 minutes laying out a legal defense that would hold up in any territorial court," he said. "You've got a physician's documentation, original correspondence, property records with proper notarization. This isn't a woman who needs rescuing." He looked at her across the table. "This is a woman who's already won. She just needs the other side to realize it." She stared at him. The storm screamed against the shutters. Somewhere in the barn the horses shifted and settled. "You believe that?" she said. Not a question, surprised. "Yes," he said. "Don't you?" A long silence. She looked at the papers on the table. She gathered them up carefully, the way she'd put them out, one at a time, replacing them in the packet. "Most days," she said finally. "Most days I believe it." What about the other days? She tied the packet shut. The other days, I just try to get through until morning, she said quietly. And then it's morning, and I try again. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would improve it. He just sat across the table from her, and the storm went on, and the lamp burned, and the stove put out its heat. After a while, she got up to check the soup and told him to get bowls down from the second shelf. And he did, and they ate supper while the mountain tried its best to bury the cabin, and neither of them said anything important, and both of them were glad for the company. But the storm lasted 3 more days. By the end of it, they knew each other's silences. They knew which ones needed filling and which ones didn't. They knew that Thorne went quiet when he was working something out in his head, and it didn't mean anything was wrong. They knew that Evelyn went quiet when something had startled the animal part of her brain, the part that had been trained to stay alert, and that the best response was to give her space and not move suddenly until her breathing evened out. They weren't friends yet. That would take longer, and it would be a different kind of thing than friendship anyway. But something had shifted in the cabin. On the last night of the storm, Evelyn came to the kitchen table and set down her coffee and looked at Thorne and said, with the particular directness that was beginning to feel like her truest voice, "I want you to know I'm grateful for the way you've—" She stopped, tried again. "You've been decent. You could have been otherwise." He looked at his coffee cup. "That's a low bar," he said. "For some men?" she said carefully. "Yes?" He nodded. Didn't argue the point. "You don't need to be grateful," he said. "You've done half the work around this place since you got here. More than half some days. I'm getting the better end of this arrangement." "That's not entirely true," she said. "It's mostly true," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, and this was the first time he'd seen it, fully, without reservation, she smiled. Brief, small, real as anything he'd ever seen on a person's face. "Don't push it, Mercer," she said. He laughed. It surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed out loud in this cabin. She looked mildly surprised too, like the sound was unexpected, but not unwelcome. She picked up her coffee and looked out at the shuttered window where the storm was finally beginning to die down. And for a while the cabin was just warm. The storm broke on a Thursday morning, quiet as an apology. Thorne was up before light to check the damage. 3 feet of snow against the north wall of the barn, one of the outbuilding doors blown off its upper hinge, and the water trough frozen solid despite the insulation he'd packed around it in October. He worked through it without rushing, methodical in the way that 11 years on a mountain makes a man, chipping ice and rehinging the door and digging a path between the cabin and the barn while the sky turned from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue. When he came back in, Evelyn was at the stove with her back to him. She'd heard his knock and called out before he finished it, which was now simply the pattern they fell into without discussing. He stamped snow off his boots and hung his coat, and she said, without turning around, "The south fence will need checking. I saw from the window. One of the posts looks canted." "I saw it too," he said. "I'll get to it after breakfast." "I can do it." "The drift on that side is still chest high," he said. "Let it settle another few hours." She turned then, spatula in hand, and looked at him with the particular expression she had when she was deciding whether an argument was worth having. She decided it wasn't. "Afternoon, then," she said. "Afternoon," he agreed. It was a small exchange, nothing in it that would mean anything to someone looking from outside. But Thorne noticed as he sat down at the table that she hadn't argued for the sake of arguing. She'd made a counter, he'd given a reason, and she'd accepted the reason. A month ago, in those first silent days when every exchange felt like it was happening through 6 inches of glass, it hadn't worked that way. A month ago, she'd accepted things because accepting had been built into her, ground in so deep it looked like agreement. Now she was actually deciding. There was a difference between those two things that mattered more than he knew how to articulate, so he just drank his coffee and didn't say anything about it. It was mid-January. She'd been here 31 days. He'd counted, not because he was marking time against her stay, but because the days had started to have shape again in a way they hadn't in a long while, and he'd noticed that too. The post-storm weeks settled into a rhythm harder and more demanding than the ones before it, which suited them both. There was too much to do for anything except doing it. The fence repairs alone took 4 days. 3 posts had heaved in the freeze, and one section of rail on the east boundary had come down entirely under the weight of snow, which meant the horses needed temporary containment while they rebuilt it. Evelyn worked the fence alongside him without being asked, handing tools, holding post sections while he drove pins, doing the kind of labor that required no instruction and no praise. She didn't look for approval when she finished a task. She just moved to the next one. On the second day of fence work, her sleeve slipped while she was wrestling a rail into position. She caught it immediately, tugging the cuff back down, and glanced at him with the automatic braced expression of someone expecting a reaction. He handed her the other end of the rail. "Hold it level," he said. "The ground's uneven here." She held it level. The sleeve stayed where she'd pulled it. Neither of them acknowledged that anything else had happened. But that night, after supper, he was aware of her being quieter than usual in a specific way. Not the listening quiet of her early days, not the tired quiet of hard labor, but something that had weight to it, like she was carrying a decision around the table and hadn't set it down yet. He let her carry it. He'd learned, in these 31 days, that pushing was the surest way to get nothing. She was washing the supper dishes and he was checking the inventory list she'd updated that afternoon. They'd need supplies within the next 3 weeks, before the next serious storm cycle, when she said, to the window above the sink rather than to him, "I know you've seen them." He didn't look up from the list. "Yes," he said. A pause. The dishwater moved. "You haven't said anything." "No," he said. "Why not?" He set the list down then and looked at her back, her shoulders, the way she was braced like she was waiting for something to land. "Because it wasn't my business until you decided it was," he said. "And because I didn't need an explanation to know what I was looking at." She turned around. Her hands were wet, still holding the cloth she'd been using. "What were you looking at?" she said. Not challenging. She actually wanted to know what he'd seen. He thought about how to say it without saying too much. "Years," he said. "Not accidents." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved, not breaking down. Nothing so dramatic as that. Just a subtle shift like a door that had been shut for a long time, moving fractionally on its hinges. "That's exactly right," she said quietly. "Years." She turned back to the dishes. He picked up the inventory list. And that was how it went. Not a confrontation, not a revelation scene, just 2 people in a kitchen after supper acknowledging a truth that had been in the room for weeks already, and then going back to what they'd been doing. But it was different after that. Something that had required energy to maintain. The careful not seeing on his side, the careful concealment on hers, was simply gone. And what replaced it was less exhausting for both of them. She started rolling her sleeves up when she cooked. Not dramatically, not as any kind of statement. Just because it was practical and the stove put out real heat and she no longer needed to. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it, he just noticed. The scars were more extensive than the brief glimpse behind the barn had suggested. Old ones, silver white, overlapped by marks that were still in the process of fading. There were burn marks too, which he hadn't seen before, though he didn't let his eyes linger. He was not going to make her feel examined, but he saw them, and he filed them alongside everything else he'd been filing. Not as information that made him feel sorry for her, though he did feel something that wasn't entirely unlike grief, but as context for a person he was still in the process of understanding. One evening, about a week after the dishwater conversation, she was sitting at the table with her arms resting flat on the surface, sleeves up, reading the book she'd had in her bag. He finally saw the cover. It was something about frontier botany, which made complete sense. And she said without looking up, "You can ask." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Ask what?" "Whatever you want to ask," she said. "I can see you being careful not to." He was quiet for a moment. How long was it before you understood what the situation was? She thought about it. She turned a page of the book, though he didn't think she was actually reading it now. 6 months, she said, give or take. There was a period before that where I kept thinking I'd done something specific wrong, and if I just figured out what it was and corrected it, things would be different. A pause. It took about 6 months to understand there wasn't a specific thing. There was just the pattern, and the pattern didn't have an exit built into it. "But you stayed 9 years. "I stayed 9 years, she said, and there was no apology in it, no shame, just fact. Because leaving looked like dying. Because his brother was on the council, and the council ran most of the civil mechanisms in that county. Because two women I knew who'd tried to leave their situations had found out that the law moves slower than the men they were leaving. She paused. Because I was afraid, she said. That's also true, and I'm not going to dress it up. I was afraid. You were right to be afraid, Thorne said. She looked at him then. Some people, he said, have never been in a situation where all the exits were controlled by someone else. So what some people think isn't worth much on this particular subject. She studied him. The fire in the stove cracked and settled. Where did you come from? She said. Not where geographically. He understood that. She meant something else. Ohio, actually, he said. Same as you, more or less, near Columbus. You left. When I was 20, he said, came west, ended up here. He turned the harness over in his hands. My father was not a kind man either, if that's what you're asking. Not in the way you mean, not to that degree. But I learned early that spaces where people leave room for each other are better than the alternative. She seemed to take that in. Is that why you came out here? For the space? Partly, he said. And partly, I'm just better with animals and weather and manual labor than I am with people. He paused. You're the longest conversation I've had in about 14 months. 14 months, she repeated. I'm not complaining, he said. I like it out here, but there's something... He stopped, and then because she was looking at him with that direct attention that had stopped making him uncomfortable sometime around day 12, he continued. It gets to a point where the quiet stops being peaceful and starts being something else. I don't have a better word for it. Empty, she said. Yes, he said. That. She looked back at her book. I know the feeling, she said. I spent 9 years surrounded by people and still felt it. A brief pause. That's the thing about being isolated that no one who hasn't been there seems to understand. You don't need to be alone to be alone. He sat with that for a while. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up on the ridge, a long, broken sound in the cold air, and then went quiet. The land, he said after a bit, the 160 acres. Tell me about it. She set the book down flat on the table. Her face didn't change much, but he could see her shift into a different mode. Something sharper, clearer, the part of her that had spent the last 2 years building a legal case rather than grieving. River bottom ground, she said. On the Clearwater tributary, eastern side. The Hartwell family acquired it in '68 as part of a larger purchase that got subdivided. Gerald got this parcel, Silas got 2 others. Gerald's parcel is the most valuable of the 3 because of water access. And he left it to you? He didn't intend to, she said, and something like dry amusement crossed her face briefly. He had a will written in '71 that left it to Silas. But in '79, 8 months before he died, he had a document drawn up by a lawyer in a different town, not anyone Silas knew, that superseded the '71 will. I didn't know about this document until after Gerald died, and I was going through his papers. She paused. I think Gerald did it out of spite, actually. He and Silas had argued badly that spring about something unrelated to me entirely, and Gerald was a man who held grudges in very practical ways. So the land came to you by accident, Thorne said, through someone else's grudge. My inheritance arrived, she said evenly, as a side effect of 2 unpleasant men having a disagreement. Yes, that's accurate. He shook his head once. And Silas waited until I'd been widowed for 2 months, she said. Then he came to the house with a man from the council and told me that the '79 document was the product of a man in mental decline who had been manipulated by a scheming wife, and that if I contested the natural disposition of the estate, which he presented as being the '71 will, the one leaving everything to him, he would make sure that the full history of my marriage became a matter of public discussion. Thorne was very still. He threatened you with it, he said. The abuse. He intended it as a threat, she said. The idea being that the shame of it becoming public would silence me. She tilted her head slightly. He hadn't considered that I'd already spent time with an attorney in Denver. He hadn't considered that I'd already had the medical examination. He didn't know about the physician's statement. A pause. He also hadn't considered that his own letters to Gerald, the ones discussing the land and what he expected to receive, were sitting in a box in Gerald's desk, which I now had full access to. He underestimated you, Thorne said. He made the mistake of seeing me as Gerald's wife instead of as myself, she said. Most of them did. It's a useful mistake for other people to make. There was something in the way she said it, precise and unsentimental, that he found himself respecting in a way that went beyond ordinary admiration. She had been through years of something that would have broken most people twice over, and what she'd built out of it was not bitterness exactly, and not hardness exactly, but something more like clarity, a very clean understanding of how things worked and who people were and what they were likely to do. Will he come here? Thorne asked. I think so, she said. Eventually. He's methodical. He won't rush, but yes. She met his eyes. I think he'll come. All right, Thorne said. She looked at him. All right, she repeated, like she was testing the weight of it. If he comes, Thorne said, you've got what you need to handle him. Everything you laid on the table during the storm. That's a solid position. He paused. And you're not in that county anymore. You're not alone in a house he has access to. Whatever he tries to move legally, he'll have to move it in a court up here, or pull you back down there, and you don't have to go. I know, she said. I'm not telling you things you don't know, he said. I'm just saying I know them too, so you're not carrying it by yourself. She was quiet for a moment. The coyote had started up again on the ridge, or maybe it was a different one. Evelyn looked at the middle distance above the table, working something out in her expression that he couldn't quite read. I'm not used to that, she said finally. I know, he said. You'll get used to it or you won't, and either way it's fine. But it's true whether you're used to it or not. She looked at him directly then, and for a second her face was entirely unguarded, not emotional in any dramatic sense, just open, the way a face looks when a person has stopped bracing for what's coming and has let themselves simply be present in a moment. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she picked up her book, and he went back to the harness, and the coyote went quiet on the ridge. That was the 28th night. There were still a lot of nights to come, and they would not all be easy, and some of them would be hard in ways that Thorne was not yet prepared for. Evelyn woke twice that week with the constrained, caught-short sound from her room that he'd learned not to respond to. She was short with him on a Wednesday afternoon over something minor, a misplaced tool that turned out to be exactly where she'd put it, not where she thought, and apologized for it later with a stiffness that suggested apology was still an act of deliberate will for her, not instinct. He burned the beans one evening because he was distracted and not paying attention, and she ate them without comment, which she said afterward was not politeness but hunger. And when he laughed about it, she gave him a look that was 3/4 genuine reproach and 1/4 something that was not. These were the things that made up the actual texture of days. Burned beans, misplaced tools, the coyote on the ridge, the harness that still needed another evening of work. But something had changed between that first night in the storm and now. And the change was this. She slept later. Not much. 20 minutes, maybe 30, past the before light hour that had been immovable since her arrival. He noticed it first on a Tuesday when he was already at the table with his coffee, and she came through from the bedroom at a light starting to leak under the east shutter rather than full darkness. She stopped when she saw him already up. You're early, she said. I'm the same time I always am, he said. You're late. She looked at him for a second, working out whether that was a criticism. He kept his expression neutral and let her work it out. Then she went to the stove and said, It's still dark, as though that settled the matter, and poured herself coffee. He didn't say anything else about it, but he thought about it later, checking the horses in the sharp cold of the late afternoon light, his breath coming in clouds and the mountains sitting above him the way they always did, patient and completely indifferent. He thought about what it meant that a woman who had spent years sleeping with one ear always open, always listening for the sound that preceded danger, had started sleeping until the sky showed light. It didn't mean she was healed. He wasn't foolish enough to think that. There was no clean ending to what she'd been through, no point at which the past would simply stop influencing the present. She'd told him herself that night at the kitchen table. Most days I believe it, and the other days I just try to get through until morning. But she was getting through until morning. And sometimes now morning arrived a little later. He drove his hands deeper into his coat pockets and looked up at the ridge where the coyote had been crying all week. And the ridge was empty and still under the cold sky, and he turned back toward the cabin where a lamp was already burning in the kitchen window, which was something else he'd started noticing, that she lit the lamp when darkness came in now, instead of sitting in the dark the way she had in those first weeks. Small things. Just small things. But he'd spent 11 years on this mountain learning to read small signs in the landscape, and he knew that small things, tracked over time, told you everything that mattered about a place. Whether the land was recovering, whether the season was turning, whether what had been damaged was slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of completion, starting to mend. He went back inside. She was at the stove. He knocked first, and then he came home. February came in like something that had been saving itself. The first week was deceptively mild, cold, but the working kind of cold, the kind that let you get things done if you move steadily. Thorne used the window to run a trap line he'd been putting off since December, covering ground up to the northeast ridge and back, 2 days out and 1 day return. He left Evelyn with a list of things that needed doing, and she looked at the list and said, "I know what needs doing," and handed it back to him without reading past the first line. He took the list with him. He didn't know why. He folded it into his coat pocket and carried it the whole trip and never looked at it once. When he got back, she had done everything on the list and 3 things that hadn't been on it, including locating and patching a gap in the root cellar ceiling that had been letting moisture in since autumn, which he hadn't even known about. He found it because she'd left a note on the cellar door, "Gap patched. Check it in spring when the ground moves again." He stood in the cold reading the note for longer than the note required, and then he went inside. "The cellar," he said. "Found it when I was checking the potato stores," she said. "The bags in the back corner were getting damp." "How did you fix it?" "Clay and pine resin," she said. "It'll hold through the rest of winter. Come spring, you'll want something more permanent." He nodded, took off his coat. "Thank you," he said. She was already back at whatever she'd been doing at the table. She'd taken to keeping records of their supply usage, a running accounting that was more detailed than anything he'd maintained in years, and she said, without looking up, "The potatoes were going to rot. It wasn't altruism." "I know," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway." She made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal, and went back to the figures. He went to hang up his coat and decided that this counted as a form of progress. The mild week ended on a Saturday. He knew it was coming because Evelyn told him Thursday afternoon, looking at the sky with the particular attention her father had apparently given her, like an inheritance worth more than land. 3 days, she said, maybe less. This one's going to be bad. How bad? She looked at him. Worse than January. He'd learned by now not to argue with her on weather. He spent Friday and all of Saturday moving, securing, reinforcing. Double hay in the barn, extra wood under the covered section where it wouldn't get buried, the livestock water situation sorted as best it could be. Evelyn worked alongside him through most of it, and when they finally came in Saturday evening, both of them tired in the bone-deep way of real physical labor, she made coffee and he sat at the table and neither of them said much. The storm arrived Sunday before dawn. He knew it before he was fully awake. The sound changed. The cabin's particular acoustics under heavy wind were different from ordinary winter noise, lower and more constant, like something pressing from all sides simultaneously. He lay in the dark of the side room, listening to it for a few minutes before he got up. Evelyn was already in the kitchen. Of course she was. The lamp was lit and she was at the stove, and she'd piled extra wood by the stove box sometime before he woke, which meant she'd been up in the dark moving wood. "Go back to bed," he said. "I didn't sleep," she said. "I know. Go back to bed anyway." She turned and looked at him with the expression she used for statements that didn't warrant argument. "Coffee is ready," she said. He sat down. She poured 2 cups. They listened to the storm announce itself against the shuttered windows, and after a while he said, "You knew this was coming and you still couldn't sleep." "Knowing it's coming doesn't make it easier to sleep through," she said. "That's not how it works." He thought about that. "What does it feel like?" he asked. "When it's bad." She was quiet for a moment, hands around her cup. She didn't seem bothered by the question. She'd gotten more comfortable with his direct questions over the last few weeks, had started to answer them with less preliminary caution. "Like something waiting," she said. "Not the storm specifically, just something. Like there's a sound about to happen that I need to be ready for. Except I don't know what sound and I don't know when. She paused. It's not reasonable. I know it's not reasonable. Doesn't need to be reasonable to be real, he said. No, she agreed, but it's exhausting. Outside, the wind built another degree, rattling the stovepipe. The lamp flame bent sideways for a moment and recovered. Evelyn's eyes tracked it automatically. The movement, the source, the assessment. And he watched her do it without drawing attention to the fact that he was watching. My father used to say that fear is just the body doing its job wrong, she said, that it's not the fear that's the problem. It's that the alarm goes off when there's no fire. She turned her cup in her hands. He meant well. He was trying to make me feel less broken about being nervous as a child. I don't think he understood what a different thing it becomes when someone spends years teaching the alarm to fire constantly. She stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you that. You're awake at 5 in the morning with nowhere to go, Thorne said. Seems like a reasonable time for it. Something in her face relaxed. Not much. Just enough. Yes, she said. I suppose so. The storm put them inside for 4 days. Not completely. The animals required attention regardless of what the sky was doing, and twice daily they made the trip to the barn together. A rope strung between the cabin door and the barn door as a guideline, because the visibility in the driven snow got bad enough on the second day that the 40-foot distance became genuinely disorienting. The first time they made the trip together, the wind hit them coming around the cabin corner with enough force to push Evelyn sideways into him, and she caught herself with a hand on his arm and said, into the wind, "Don't say anything." Wasn't going to, he said, and kept walking. Inside, in the long hours between barn trips and stove tending, and the practical small work of being snowed in, they talked more than they had in all the previous weeks combined. It happened incrementally, the way most things between them had happened. Not one large decision, but a series of small ones, each one slightly further than the last. She told him about her father's farm in more detail. The wheat cycles, the particular flatness of Ohio earth, the way spring came differently there than anywhere she'd been since. He told her about Columbus in the early 1860s, the particular energy of a city at the edge of a country tearing itself apart. How he'd been 17 when the war started and 20 when he finally understood it wasn't going to be something that happened somewhere else and came out here instead. You didn't fight, she said. Not accusatory, just locating a fact. No, he said. Why not? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Fear, he said, and I'm not going to dress it up either. I was afraid of dying, and I left. He paused. I've made my peace with it over the years. I'm not sure that peace is entirely deserved, but there it is. She looked at him steadily. My husband was a council elder who used his position to keep himself well clear of the conscription, she said. So when you tell me you were afraid and you left, I'm not in a position to judge. I know, he said. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm just telling you the truth. I know you are, she said. And something in the way she said it, simply, without any particular ceremony, made it clear that the truth, for her, was rarer and more valuable than most things, and that she recognized it when she encountered it. It was on the third day of the storm, late afternoon, the light outside what little could be called light going gray and then gone, that she took the leather packet from the carpet bag and put it on the table again. Not as urgently as she had in January. The storm then had been the first big one, and the stakes and her fear had both been raw. This time she put it down with the deliberateness of someone who had decided something. I want to go through it with you properly, she said. All of it. Not just what I told you before. All right, he said. She untied the packet and spread everything out on the table the way she had before, but this time she arranged it differently. Not as a stack, but laid out, document by document, in an order that he realized after a moment was chronological. She was organizing the narrative, telling the story with paper. This is the original deed from '68, she said, putting down a yellowed document that crinkled at the edges. The full parcel before it was subdivided. Gerald's signature is on the subdivision agreement here. And here's his parcel, 160 acres, registered in his name in the county record. That's the baseline. The thing Silas can't dispute, Thorne said. He's not trying to dispute ownership of the land itself, she said. He's disputing the inheritance, so the 71 will. She put down another document. This is a copy. The original is in the county courthouse. Gerald left everything to Silas in 71, which Silas obviously knew about. What he didn't know, she reached into the packet and produced a document with a different, heavier paper stock. Is this? Thorne took it, read it. It was a legal instrument executed in November of 1879 by Gerald Hart, in the presence of one Thomas Becket, attorney at law, Millbrook County, superseding all prior testamentary documents and directing that the 160-acre parcel designated as Hartwell River Bottom, grant number 3, pass to Evelyn Margaret. Hart upon Gerald Hart's death in fee simple, with no conditions or encumbrances. This Becket, Thorne said, he'd still testify to it? He already has, in a written affidavit notarized and filed with the territorial court, she said. She produced another document and set it beside the first. Gerald went to him specifically because he was in a different county from anyone Silas knew. Becket had no reason to cooperate with Silas and every professional reason not to. Smart, Thorne said. Gerald wasn't stupid, she said. He was cruel and controlling and paranoid, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that the document was ironclad as long as it stayed hidden, and he hid it well. She paused. I think he also knew, on some level, that if he died first, I might actually need it. I don't think he did it for my sake, but the effect is the same regardless of the motivation. The letters, Thorne said. Silas's letters. She produced 3 folded sheets, each one in a different envelope. Written between 1876 and 1878, she said, Gerald kept everything. Every letter he ever received organized in boxes in his study. I don't know if he intended them as insurance or if he was simply a man who couldn't throw anything away. She placed the letters on the table. In 1876, Silas wrote asking Gerald to confirm that the land would come to him upon Gerald's death, citing the 71 will by name. Gerald's reply is not in my possession, but Silas's subsequent letters make it clear Gerald told him yes, establishing that Silas knew about the 71 will and believed himself to be the beneficiary, Thorne said, which means when the 79 document contradicts that, Silas has a documented expectation he was deliberately cut out of. She looked at him with something that might have been surprise at his quickness, or might have been satisfaction at being understood. Exactly, she said. His argument is that Gerald was manipulated by me into changing his will. But if Gerald was being manipulated by me in 1879, why did Gerald write to Silas in 1876 confirming the original arrangement? I would have had to have begun my campaign of manipulation, then reversed it, and then continued it, which makes no sense as a narrative. And the physician's statement, Thorne said. She set it on the table last. He didn't pick it up this time. He'd read it once, and that had been sufficient. If Silas challenges the inheritance in court, she said, all of this goes in. The deed, the 79 document, Becket's affidavit, the letters. And this. She touched the physician's statement with one finger. A detailed clinical record of 9 years of injuries documented by a physician who had no professional relationship with Gerald or with Silas or with anyone in that county, which rather comprehensively dismantles the narrative of the devoted wife who manipulated a good man for financial gain. The storm pressed against the walls. The lamp put out its steady light across the documents, all that paper representing all those years spread on a trapper's table in a mountain cabin in February. He doesn't know about the physician's statement, Thorne said. No, she said. He knows I have legal documents. He doesn't know I have that. A pause. When I left, I went to Denver first. I spent 3 weeks there. I saw the attorney. I had the examination. I filed copies of the deed and the 79 document with the territorial court. I arranged for Becket's affidavit to be transmitted there as well. She folded her hands on the table. I made sure that everything I needed was in a place Silas couldn't reach before I went anywhere he might look. You planned it for a long time, he said. 2 years, she said. From the day Gerald died, I spent 2 years getting ready to leave, making sure I had everything, making sure he couldn't undo it once I was gone. She looked at her folded hands. It felt like the longest 2 years of my life, longer than any of the 9 before them, because I could see the door but I couldn't go through it yet. He understood that. The particular cruelty of being able to see the thing you needed and having to wait until everything was exactly in position before moving toward it. He'd been patient in his life out of necessity, waiting out weather and seasons and the slow movements of animals in the land, but that was nothing like what she was describing. His patience had been a choice. Hers had been something closer to survival arithmetic. "He'll come," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd said it before in January, and she was saying it again now, more settled in the fact of it. "Probably in spring. He'll have spent the winter figuring out where I went and working out his approach. He'll come with legal language and the expectation that I'm still who I was when I lived in that house." She finally looked up from her hands and met his eyes across the table. "And I need you to understand something, Thorne." He waited. "When he comes," she said, "I'm going to handle it. I'm not asking you to step in front of me. I'm not asking you to speak for me or manage it for me or—" She stopped. "I spent 9 years having everything managed for me. I'm not looking to replace that with a different version of it. When Silas walks through that door, I am the one who will deal with him." "I know," Thorne said. "I mean it." "Evelyn," he said, and he didn't use her name often enough that it landed when he did. "I know. I'm not Gerald, and I'm not Silas, and I've spent 2 months watching you prepare for this. You don't need me to fight your battles, and I'm not going to try." He paused. "But I'm going to be in the room." She looked at him. Something worked in her expression. Not resistance, more like she was checking the statement from multiple angles, looking for the version of it that was actually a trap. "As a witness," he said. "Nothing more. Someone who can confirm what was said and how it went." After a moment, she nodded. "As a witness," she said. "Yes, all right." She gathered the documents and repacked the leather packet with the same deliberate care she always used, re-sewing the stitches along the lining of the carpet bag where she'd opened them. He watched her hands do the work, steady, precise. A woman who sewed hidden documents into luggage linings like it was just another task. Maybe it was now. Maybe enough repetition of a strange thing made it ordinary. He didn't know. He didn't ask. The storm broke sometime in the deep middle of the 4th night, one of those sudden endings that were more disorienting than the storm itself. All that noise and pressure simply absent, the silence almost loud by contrast. Thorne came awake in the sudden quiet and lay still, recalibrating. The stove had died down and the cabin was cold in the upper air, but still tolerable. He got up to feed the stove and found Evelyn already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a candle and the botany book, fully dressed, apparently having been up for some time. "It stopped," he said, meaning the storm. "About an hour ago," she said, without looking up from the book. He fed the stove and pulled his coat on over his shirt and sat down across from her. The candle put soft light across both their faces and the table between them. Outside, for the first time in 4 days, there was silence that wasn't wind, just the cold and the mountains and the particular stillness that follows major weather, the world reset and waiting. "You should sleep," he said. "I was reading," she said. "You can read in the morning. I'm not tired." She turned a page. He looked at her across the candle and she looked up, and he must have had some expression on his face because she said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "That's not your nothing face," she said. He was surprised enough by that to be quiet for a second. "I have a nothing face?" "You have several faces," she said, with the particular dryness that had been coming out more often in the last few weeks, a dry wit that he suspected had always been there but had been buried under 9 years of it being unsafe to use. "You have a working something out face and a something bothering me face and a straightforward nothing face, and that wasn't it." "You've been studying my faces," he said. "I study everyone's faces," she said. "I've been doing it since I was 27. It's a useful skill when you need to know what's coming." He thought about that. About the kind of reading you learned when your safety depended on correctly interpreting another person's expression before they spoke. "What does my current face say?" She looked at him directly across the candle flame. "That you're thinking about the fact that it's the middle of the night and I'm still awake and the storm is over," she said. "And you're wondering if that's a good sign or a bad one." He held her gaze. "Is it?" She considered, seemingly genuinely. "I don't know yet," she said. "The storm ended and I'm still awake and my heart isn't pounding, so—" She looked back at the book. "Maybe that's something." He sat with that for a while, the candle burning between them, the cold mountain settling into itself outside. Maybe that's something. He thought that was about as honest an assessment of incremental progress as he'd ever heard anyone give. And there was something in the honesty of it. in the refusal to make it more than it was or pretend it wasn't what it was. That struck him as maybe the truest thing about her. After a while, she made tea, because the night was cold, and neither of them was going back to sleep, and they sat at the table while the cabin warmed up, and the outside world held its new silence, and the candle burned down to a stub, and nobody said anything important, and both of them stayed. Spring came late to the mountain, the way it always did. Not a arrival so much as a slow negotiation between the cold that had owned everything for 5 months and the light that was finally putting in longer hours. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving mud and matted grass and the particular smell of ground that had been frozen solid since November, finally remembering what it was supposed to do. Thorne noticed Evelyn watching the south road more in March. Not constantly, not with the flinching hypervigilance of her first weeks, but with a new kind of attention, focused and intermittent, the way you watch for something you've calculated is coming rather than something you fear without reason. She'd made her assessment, and she was tracking against it. He said nothing about it. She knew what she was doing. He was cutting wood behind the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, when she appeared at the corner of the building. He knew by the way she was standing before she said anything. "Ryder," she said. "South Road. Still a ways out." He set the axe down. "How many?" "One." A pause. "He's alone." He looked at her face. She was pale, but her jaw was set and her eyes were clear. The carpet bag, he knew without asking, was already on the kitchen table. She'd been ready for this for 2 months. "You want to go in?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to be inside when he arrives. I want to be the thing he sees when he comes through the door, not someone who was fetched from outside." He picked up the axe and put it back in the wood block. "Then let's go in," he said. By the time hoofbeats came into the yard, the documents were laid out on the kitchen table in the same chronological order she'd established during the February storm, weighted at the corners with 2 coffee cups and a tin of salt so the drafts from the door wouldn't disturb them. Evelyn was standing at the far end of the table, facing the door. Not sitting. Standing. Thorne was to the side, near the window, where he could see the table and the door, and her face without being directly in the sightline between her and whoever came in. Witness position. That was what he'd told her, and that was what he intended. The knock, when it came, was the knock of a man who considered knocking a formality. 3 sharp raps, and then the door opened without waiting. Silas Hartwell was perhaps 55, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of groomed gray beard that communicated deliberate respectability. He wore a good coat, travel-dusty but well cut, and he carried a leather satchel under one arm. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around his presence, and for a fraction of a second, coming through that door, his body language said he expected this room to do the same. Then he saw Evelyn standing at the end of the table with her hands at her sides, and the documents spread out between them, and something in his face recalculated. "Evelyn," he said. He didn't look at Thorne yet. "This is quite a place you've found." "Silas," she said. Her voice was even, completely even. "You can close the door. It's cold." He closed it. His eyes moved around the room. Inventory, the same thing she did, though his was about dominance rather than safety, and landed on Thorne. "And you're the trapper," he said. "Mercer," Thorne said. He didn't offer a hand. "I'll let you two talk." "Good," Silas said, as though Thorne had been addressing him rather than Evelyn. Thorne didn't move from the window. Silas seemed to decide this wasn't worth pressing and turned his attention back to Evelyn and the table between them. He looked at the documents the way a man looks at something he's been told is a weapon but hasn't yet confirmed. Careful. Not showing concern. But careful. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been organized," she said. "There's a difference. Sit down if you'd like." He didn't sit. Men like Silas didn't sit when they could stand, because standing was a few inches of advantage, and men like Silas counted inches. "I came a long way," he said. "I'd hoped we could settle this without all the—" He gestured at the table. "Paperwork." "I'm sure you did," she said. "Sit down, Silas." He sat. She remained standing. Thorne noticed that she'd positioned herself so that Silas would have to look up at her slightly across the table, and he wondered if she'd done that deliberately or if it had been instinct. Looking at her face, he decided deliberately. "You know why I'm here," Silas said. You want the land, she said. You've wanted it since November of 1879, which I know because you wrote to Gerald about it in January of 1880, and he kept the letter. She reached down and moved the first of the 3 letters slightly toward him without picking it up. That one. You can read it if you've forgotten what you said. Silas's eyes went to the letter. A muscle in his jaw moved. Those are private correspondence. They were private correspondence between you and Gerald, she said. Gerald is dead. The correspondence belongs to his estate. I am his estate. She moved to the legal instrument, the 79 document, and turned it to face him. This is the instrument Gerald executed in November 1879. You'll see it's properly witnessed, properly notarized, and as of 3 weeks after Gerald's death, filed with the territorial court in Denver, along with a copy of the original deed and an affidavit from Thomas Becket, who drew it up. Silas looked at the document. He picked it up, which she let him do. He read it, or pretended to, or read it and pretended he was only pretending. Thorne watched his face from the window and saw the particular stillness of a man who already knew most of what was in front of him and was working out how much she knew about what he knew. Gerald was not well in 1879, Silas said. He set the document down. Anyone who knew him could tell you that. The man had been in decline for years. Interesting, Evelyn said. Thomas Becket noted no signs of cognitive impairment at the time of execution. He says so specifically in his affidavit. She touched Beckett's affidavit without moving it. Also interesting, the 71 will that you prefer was executed 8 years before you claimed Gerald was in decline. If he was capable of a valid will in 71, why would the same man be incapable of one in 79? That's 8 years of sustained incompetence you'd need to account for. Silas shifted in the chair. He was influenced, he said. You were in that house. You had access to him that— I was in that house, she agreed. I was in that house for 9 years. I have documentation of what those 9 years looked like. She reached for the physician's statement, and here was the moment Thorne had been waiting to see. She placed it in front of Silas with a quietness that was more devastating than any raised voice could have been. Dr. Adolphus Crane, Denver. The examination was conducted 8 months after Gerald's death. Dr. Crane documented everything, his methodology, his findings, his professional conclusions. Silas looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. If you bring a challenge in any court, Evelyn said, this enters the record, along with your letters, along with Beckett's affidavit, along with the deed and the 79 instrument. She let that sit for a moment. The full history, Silas. Everything Gerald and you and the council worked to keep quiet. It becomes public record. The room was completely still. Outside, a horse shifted in the yard. The stove put out its steady heat. You think a territorial court is going to take a widow's side over— Silas started. Over documented evidence, she said. Yes. I think a territorial court is going to follow documented evidence because that is what courts do when the evidence is sufficient and properly filed and impossible to misplace. Her voice hadn't changed register once in this entire conversation. Not once. Thorne found it remarkable. He found her remarkable. But more than that, I think you know it too. I think that's why you came yourself instead of sending a lawyer. A lawyer would have told you the position isn't tenable. You came yourself because you were hoping I was still who I was 5 years ago, and you could talk me into backing down. Silas said nothing. I'm not, she said simply. I'm not that person anymore. A long silence. Silas looked at the physician's statement he still hadn't picked up. He looked at the letters. He looked at Evelyn standing across the table from him, and whatever he was searching for in her face, the fear, the uncertainty, the woman who'd learned to make herself small, he didn't find it. He looked for the first time at Thorne. You've got nothing to add, he said. The tone suggested this was an avenue, that Thorne might be an ally, another man who could be brought around to the reasonable position of managing an unreasonable woman. Thorne looked at him from the window. She's covered it, he said. Silas turned back to Evelyn. He made one more attempt, because men like Silas always made one more attempt. The council has resources, he said. This could be made very difficult for you, legally complicated in ways that take years, and— I have time, she said. I have a properly registered inheritance, a physician's documented evidence of 9 years of abuse at the hands of your brother, and your own written correspondence establishing your prior knowledge of an expectation under the 71 will. If you want to spend years in court watching all of that become increasingly public, that is your choice. A pause. But I want you to think carefully about what that means for the council, for the men on it, for the community that has trusted their judgment. Silas went still in a different way than before. This was not the stillness of a man recalculating. This was the stillness of a man who had reached the edge of the board and found there were no more moves on it. He stood up. He picked up his leather satchel. He looked at the documents on the table one more time, and something in his face that had been arranged in authority when he walked through the door had come apart at the seams without ever fully breaking. He still looked like a man of standing, but the standing had shifted, tilted, lost something underneath it that wasn't coming back. "You've thought about this carefully," he said. It came out halfway between an accusation and something that might, in a different man, have been acknowledgement. "For 2 years," she said. "Yes." He buttoned his coat, didn't look at Thorne, moved toward the door. His hand was on the latch when Evelyn spoke again, and her voice was the same quiet, even register it had been throughout. But there was something underneath it now. Not triumph, not anger, just a terrible and earned certainty. "Silas," she said. He stopped. "Don't come back," she said. "I have no interest in pursuing this further if you don't. But if you do, if you send lawyers, if you file anything in any court, if you contact me through any channel, everything goes in. All of it. I will not negotiate, and I will not be patient about it a second time." She held his gaze. "I spent 9 years being patient. I'm done with it." He opened the door. Cold spring air came in from the yard. He didn't say anything else. He went through the door and pulled it closed behind him. And through the window, Thorne watched him cross the yard to his horse, mount without hurrying. Because men like Silas did not visibly hurry, even in defeat, and ride back down the south road the way he'd come. Evelyn stood at the end of the table with her hands braced on the surface, looking at the documents still spread out between the coffee cups and the tin of salt. Her shoulders were rising and falling with her breathing. Thorne stayed at the window until Silas was fully out of the yard and down the road, and then he turned. She was still looking at the table. "Evelyn," he said. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her a minute. He went to the stove and put the kettle on because it was the only practical thing he could think to do with his hands. And he stood with his back to her and listened to her breathe until the breathing evened out and steadied. "All right," she said. He turned around. She was still standing, but she'd straightened up, taken her hands off the table. Her face was doing something complicated. Not tears, nothing that simple, just a kind of rearranging, like a structure that had been held rigid under load for a long time and was now, carefully, beginning to relax into its natural shape. "You didn't shake," he said. She looked at her hands as if checking. "No," she said. "I didn't?" "The whole time," he said. "Your voice never changed." "I practiced," she said. "You practiced?" "Out in the barn," she said. "When you were running the trap line in February. I stood in the barn and I said it out loud to the horses until it came out the way I needed it to." She looked at him. They were very patient about it. He laughed, surprised again, the same way the first time, and she watched him laugh with something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was close to it in a way that mattered more than a smile would have. "How many times?" he said. "Enough," she said. He pulled 2 cups from the shelf. The kettle was heating. Outside, the south road was empty and still, and the mud in the yard was showing the first pale green of early grass coming in at the edges where the sun hit longest, and the mountains above were doing what they'd done every day of every year, regardless of what happened below them, which was stand there and be mountains. "It's done," she said, not like she was asking, like she was testing the sound of it in the air. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She sat down at the table for the first time during the entire encounter, sat in the chair Silas had occupied, and looked at the documents spread out in front of her, all that paper that represented all those years, and she put one hand flat on the physician's statement, not pressing it, just resting her palm there, and stayed like that for a moment. Thorne set a cup of tea beside her hand and went to stand at the window. The south road stayed empty. The mud in the yard dried a little in the thin March sun. One of the barn cats appeared from somewhere and sat on the porch step, cleaning its face with total indifference to everything that had just happened inside, which seemed about right. He turned to say something. He wasn't sure what, something small and ordinary, the kind of thing that moved a moment forward into the next one, and found she was already looking at him. "Thank you," she said, "for staying in the room." "You did it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He understood. He nodded once and went back to looking out the window, and she picked up her tea and the afternoon light moved across the table and the documents on it. And neither of them said anything else for a while. And that was exactly enough. The week after Silas rode down the South Road, Evelyn slept 8 hours straight for the first time since she'd arrived. Thorne knew because he was up at his usual hour, and the cabin was still quiet past 6, past 6:30, past the point where she'd always been at the window or the stove. He made coffee and sat at the table and did not make any unnecessary noise, and at 7:15 he heard her move in the bedroom, and a few minutes later she came through the door with her hair not yet pinned and her eyes carrying the particular heaviness of genuine deep sleep, the kind your body takes when it finally decides the threat level has dropped enough to let go. She looked at him sitting at the table with his coffee and the already fed stove and said, "You didn't wake me." "No," he said. She sat down. He poured her coffee without being asked, which he'd started doing sometime in February without either of them making note of it. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the east window where the morning light was doing something decent across the ridge. "I dreamed about Ohio," she said. "Good dream or bad one?" She thought about it. "Neither," she said. "Just Ohio. The wheat fields in July. That particular color when the light comes in low." She paused. "I haven't dreamed about Ohio in years. I mostly just don't dream, or if I do, it's—" She stopped. He knew what the other kind was. "It was just wheat fields," she said. That was all. He drank his coffee. "Sounds all right," he said. "It was," she said, and sounded mildly surprised by this, the way you sound when you've expected an ordinary thing to be harder than it turns out to be. She filed the inheritance formally the following week. It required a 3-day trip down to the county seat, which was the longest either of them had been off the mountain since her arrival. Thorne drove the wagon, and she sat beside him with the leather packet in the satchel across her shoulder. And they didn't talk much on the way down. Not uncomfortable silence, just the silence of two people who had gotten past the point of needing to fill space with words. The land office was a squat building at the end of the main street with a clerk who looked barely old enough to shave and who went pink around the ears when Evelyn placed the full documentation in front of him and walked him through it piece by piece with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this in a barn for 2 months. The clerk found nothing irregular and nothing incomplete and stamped 3 copies and told her the registration would be complete within 30 days. "That's it?" Thorne said when they were back outside on the street. "That's it," she said. "I expected more resistance." "The resistance was going to come from Silas, not from a land clerk doing his job," she said. "Silas is gone." She tucked the satchel strap more securely over her shoulder. "Paperwork is just paperwork when no one is trying to stop you." They stayed in town that night at a boarding house, separate rooms, which went without saying and which neither of them addressed, and ate supper at a place down the street that had venison stew and bread that was still warm from the oven. It was the first time they'd eaten a meal somewhere other than the cabin kitchen, which made it feel oddly formal. The two of them at a table with other people around and lamps on the wall, and a woman asking if they wanted more bread. "This is strange," Evelyn said, not quietly enough, and the woman with the bread gave her a look, and Thorne covered his mouth with his hand for a moment before he got his expression back under control. "Strange how?" he said. "All these people," she said, lower. "I'd forgotten what it's like. The noise of it. You grew up in a town." "I know," she said, "but I spent a winter on a mountain." She looked around the room. Taking inventory, he noticed, the way she always did, though it was less reflexive now, more habitual than urgent. "It's fine," she said. "It's just loud." "You can tell me what everyone in the room is feeling," he said, "given your skills." She looked at him sharply, and then she actually surveyed the room with the kind of attention she'd been applying to him for months and said, "The man by the window is waiting for someone who's late and getting angry about it. The couple in the corner are having a disagreement they've agreed not to have in public. The woman who brought us bread is tired and her feet hurt." She looked back at Thorne. "The man across from me is amused." "Accurate," he said. "It's It's not a skill, she said. It's just paying attention. Most people don't pay that kind of attention, he said. Most people haven't needed to, she said, and the dryness in it was complete and uncomplicated, not bitter, just factual, the way she'd gotten increasingly good at being factual about her own history without letting it pull her under every time she touched it. They drove back up the mountain the next morning in early April light that was genuinely warm for the first time since October, the kind of warmth that had texture to it, that you could feel on your face and the backs of your hands while you held the reins. The mud on the road was drying into something negotiable, and the scrub pine on the lower slopes was putting out new growth at the tips, small and bright against the older dark needles. The river bottom land, Thorne said on the way up. What are you going to do with it? She'd been looking at the tree line. She turned to him. I've been thinking about that, she said. I can't work it from here. It's 3 days' travel. You could sell it. I could, she said. Or I could lease it. There's a farming family in that county I knew slightly. The Aldersons. They're good people and they're land poor. They've been working rented ground for years. She paused. I wrote to them in February. Mrs. Alderson wrote back. They're interested in a long-term lease arrangement. He looked at her. You wrote to them in February. I like to plan ahead, she said, while Silas hadn't come yet. While Silas hadn't come yet, she agreed, but I was fairly confident about how that was going to go. He shook his head once, not in exasperation, but in something that was its cousin in a friendlier direction. You are the most prepared person I have ever met, he said. I spent 2 years learning to be, she said. Before that, I was the least prepared. She looked back at the road ahead of them. The lease income won't be enormous, but it'll be reliable, and the Aldersons will take care of the land, which matters to me. She paused. Land should be worked. It goes wrong when it just sits. Agreed, he said. They drove in comfortable silence for a while. The horses knew the road home and didn't need much guidance, which left Thorne to think about what he'd been putting off thinking about for the last several weeks. He'd been aware of it the way you're aware of a weight you've been carrying long enough that you've mostly stopped noticing it, until you shift position and suddenly it's all you can feel. There's something I want to say, he said, and I want to say it plainly, and I don't want you to feel any pressure from it in any direction. She turned to look at him. Her expression was careful in the old way, not the new way, which told him she'd caught the weight of it already. All right, she said. I know how this started, he said. The arrangement, the agency, what it was supposed to be and what it hasn't exactly been. He kept his eyes on the road. You came here because you needed to go somewhere that wasn't there, and I sent for someone because the cabin had gotten to the point where the quiet was the wrong kind. Neither of those are particularly romantic origins. No, she said, but I want you to know that somewhere in the last 4 months, he said, this stopped being an arrangement for me. I don't know exactly when. I don't think there was a specific moment. It was more like he stopped because he was not naturally a man who talked about things like this, and the language didn't come easily. Like the way the season changes. You don't see it happen, but one day you look up and it's different. She was quiet. He kept driving. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I mean that. You just got free of a life where someone else decided what you owed him. I'm not going to be another version of that. If what works for you is what we've been doing, just 2 people running a place together with separate rooms and separate understanding, then that works for me too. I'd rather have that than push for something and lose what we've built. He paused. But I'd also feel dishonest if I didn't tell you the truth, because you've been straight with me from the start, and you deserve the same. The horses moved, the road climbed. A hawk circled something in the meadow below the tree line, patient and unhurried. Evelyn said, after a long time, How long did it take you to work up to saying that? Since February, roughly, he said. That's 2 months. I'm not a fast mover, he said. She made a sound. He glanced over, and she was looking at the road ahead, and she was smiling. Not the brief testing smile he'd first seen by the stove that night the February storm broke, but something fuller, more settled, less surprised by itself. It lasted longer than the others had. I don't know what I'm capable of yet, she said. That's the honest answer. I know what I'm not. I'm not who I was in that house. I'm not going back to that. But I don't entirely know yet who I'm going to be on the other side of it, Because I've only been on the other side of it for 4 months. She turned to look at him, and her face was open and direct in the way it was when she was telling him something she'd worked out carefully and was certain of. What I know is that I trust you. I haven't trusted anyone in a very long time, and it turns out it's not something you just decide to do. It happens because someone earns it, consistently, over time. You've done that. She paused. So I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to figure out who I am first, and I need to do it without feeling like there's a clock on it. There's no clock, he said. I know, she said. That's why I can say yes to figuring it out. He nodded. Something in his chest that had been set in a particular braced position for about 2 months shifted and resettled into something more comfortable. Not resolution, not everything resolved and tied up. That was not the kind of people they were, or the kind of life this was. But something better than the weight he'd been carrying. An understanding, a direction. All right, he said. All right, she said, and they drove the rest of the way up the mountain with the April light on their faces and the horses finding their own pace on the familiar road. Summer came, and with it the work that summer required, which on a mountain was a different animal than winter work, but no less demanding. Thorne ran his full trap line through May and into June, and Evelyn managed the homestead through the week-long stretches when he was deep in the upper country, and she did it well. Not easily. Nothing was easy, but with the competence she'd had from the beginning and a steadiness underneath it that was new, or newer, something that had been growing since March. He came back from a 6-day run in late June to find her in the process of re-shingling the barn roof. Not planning to. Actually on the roof, 3 rows in, with a stack of shingles he didn't know they had, and a technique that suggested she'd done this before. Where did the shingles come from? He said, from the ground below. I found them in the back of the workshop, behind those boxes you haven't opened since apparently 1870-something, she said, without stopping work. You had enough for the whole south face. I started yesterday. He stood looking up at her on the barn roof in the June sun, with pine pitch on her hands and her hair escaping its pin on one side, working a hammer with the practiced efficiency of a person who did not particularly need to be observed in order to function. He'd been gone 6 days. She had reshod one of the horses, cleared the drainage ditch on the east side of the cabin that had been backing up since the snowmelt, and gotten 3 rows into a roofing job he'd been postponing for 2 years. Do you want help? He said. I want you to get the other hammer from the workshop and stop standing there, she said. He got the other hammer. They worked the roof through the afternoon, and it was not elegant work. He overcorrected on 2 rows and had to pull them and reset. And she dropped the tin of nails off the edge at one point and said something under her breath that made him raise his eyebrows. But by evening the south face was done, and the barn was tighter than it had been in years, and they sat on the peak of the roof in the last of the daylight, with their feet on the finished shingles, and looked at the mountain above them and the valley below. And neither of them said anything for a long time. I found a letter at the post when I was in town last week, she said. From the Aldersons? From them, yes. The lease is agreed. They'll take possession in August. She was quiet a moment. It's real now. The land is mine, and I'm leasing it to people who'll work it, and Silas hasn't written or sent anyone, and the territorial court filing is complete. She looked at the horizon, the mountains going blue in the evening distance. I keep waiting to feel more than I feel about it, like there should be some larger thing, but mostly I just feel tired, he offered. Done, she said. Like a task that took a very long time is finally finished, and now I need to figure out what I do with the time I was spending on it. You could start with sleeping past 6, he said. She turned and looked at him. I slept until 6:45 on Tuesday. I know, he said. I noticed. She looked at him a moment longer, then back at the horizon. You notice a lot, she said. Occupational habit, he said. The mountain teaches you to read what's changing. And what's changing, she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, with the directness she reserved for questions she actually wanted answered. He thought about what he'd been reading over these months. The small signs, the incremental shifts, the things that only registered if you'd been paying close attention from the beginning. The lamp lit at dusk instead of sitting in the dark. The sleeves rolled up at the stove. The sound, or rather the increasing absence of the sound, from the bedroom in the deep of the night. 6:45 on a Tuesday. You are, he said. Slowly, but definitely. She absorbed that. A nighthawk cut across the sky above the ridge, its call sharp and then gone. The air was warm in the way summer evenings on the mountain were warm. Not the warmth of somewhere lower and easier, but a gift of warmth, specific and temporary, the kind you noticed because you knew what surrounded it. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't miss Ohio," she said. "I thought I would. I thought when I left I was leaving everything familiar and I'd spend years wanting it back." She looked at the cabin below them, the woodpile he'd been building since May, the garden she'd put in on the south side of the cabin in a strip of ground that caught morning sun, the horses in the paddock below the barn. "I don't want it back. I want this." A pause. "I didn't know that was something I was allowed to want. A specific place, a life that fits the shape I actually have instead of one I was forced into." She stopped. "That's probably not—" "It makes sense," he said. Don't qualify it." She was quiet. The evening settled around them. Then she said, "My father used to say that home isn't where you're from, it's where you stop running." She hadn't mentioned her father in a while. The tone was gentler than it used to be when she spoke of him. Not grief exactly, more like memory that had found its proper weight. "I thought that was something old people said that didn't mean anything. I was 22 when he told me that." "What do you think now?" he said. She looked at the cabin below them, at the garden and the barn and the mountain and the long view down the valley. "I think he was right," she said. "I think I've stopped running." Autumn arrived early, which the mountain did when it felt like it, regardless of what the calendar said. The aspens on the north slopes went gold by the second week of September, which Thorne told her was 3 weeks ahead of average, and she said, "The summer was hot and dry, the trees are stressed," and he said, "You've been here one full cycle, and you're already explaining the aspens to me." And she said, "I'm explaining them to both of us." He left for a long hunting expedition in October, the deep country to the northeast, a route that took him out for the better part of 2 weeks. It was the longest he'd been away since she arrived. She told him she'd be fine, which he knew. He went anyway, because the work required it, and she understood that. That was what the life was. He came back in the second week of October, half frozen and carrying enough game to see them well through the worst of winter, the horses loaded and his hands so cold they'd stopped working properly on the last day. He came down the final stretch of trail toward the cabin in the gray late afternoon light and saw the lamp already burning in the kitchen window, saw the smoke from the stove, saw the cabin sitting solid and alive against the darkening mountain. She heard him in the yard and came out without a coat on, which she immediately seemed to regret in the cold air, and looked at his hands. "Get inside," she said, "right now." "The horses—" "I'll do the horses," she said. "Go inside, your hands are white. I've got them." "Thorne." She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the barn, which was an act of absolute confidence he realized distantly that she couldn't have done 4 months ago, not physically blocked him, not stood in his way. "I'll do the horses. You go inside and put your hands in the warm water bowl I have on the stove, and don't argue with me about it." He looked at her standing in the yard without a coat in October telling him what to do, and he thought about all the things that had accumulated between them to make this exact moment possible, and he said, "All right." Inside there was warm water in a bowl on the stove, exactly as she'd said, which meant she'd had it ready before she came out, which meant she'd been watching for him and had anticipated the state he'd be in. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands in the bowl and felt the burning sensation that meant circulation returning to territory it had vacated, and he did not say anything about how much it hurt because there was no point. She came in 20 minutes later, having done his horses, and she did not make anything of it. She hung up her coat and checked his hands, which were going from white to red in the way that meant they'd be fine, and she said, "3 of your supplies are low. I made a list," and got supper going. The supper she made that night was better than the one she'd made the first night, and it had been good then. He told her so, and she said, "It's the same recipe," and he said, "It's not the same cook," and she looked at him for a moment across the table. "Is that a compliment?" she said. "Yes," he said. She picked up her fork. "You've gotten better at those," she said. "I've had practice," he said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, and he recognized it from early February when she'd been deciding whether his observations merited response, and realized that this version of it was different from that one. Warmer by some degree that didn't have a name, easier in itself, more like its own small private language between them than anything she'd inherited from Caution. That night, the first real cold of autumn came down off the ridge and settled into the valley below. He could hear it in the way the cabin responded, the particular contraction of the logs, the sound the stove made when the outside temperature dropped faster than the fire could compensate. He lay in the side room, listening to the mountain settle into its winter mode, and thought about the year that had passed. He was not a man who spent much time on reflection. The life didn't encourage it. There was always too much present tense requiring attention. But in the dark of the side room, with the cold coming in and the cabin holding against it, he found himself thinking about the woman who'd come off that train platform in December with her carpet bag and her measuring eyes, who'd asked about the bolt on the bedroom door before she'd seen the room, who'd rolled her sleeves down in the barn and then, one day, stopped rolling them down. He thought about what it cost a person to learn that fear, and what it cost to unlearn it, and how it didn't unlearn cleanly or all at once, but in pieces, over months, in increments so small you could only see them if you'd been paying close attention from the beginning. He thought about all the small things he'd been tracking, the lamp at dusk, the Tuesday morning, the aspens explained back at him, and how they added up to something that resisted a single word but was real and solid regardless. The scars were still there. They always would be. That was the thing people didn't say plainly enough, he thought. That the marks of what someone had survived didn't go away when the survival was complete. They stayed. They were part of the record of a person's life. And the question was never whether they'd disappear, but whether they'd stop being the loudest thing in the room. He thought they had, mostly. Not perfectly. Evelyn was not a perfect person, and neither was he, and the life they were building was not a perfect life. It was a working one, practical and sometimes hard, and full of burned beans and dropped nails and cold hands, and the wrong kind of silence occasionally interrupting the right kind. That was what it actually was. It seemed to him considerably better than the alternative. In the morning, she was at the window when he came out, which sometimes happened still, especially when the weather changed overnight and the animal part of her needed to reorient. But she was holding her coffee and her shoulders were easy, and she turned when she heard him without flinching, and she said, "The north pasture fence is going to need attention before the serious snow comes. I can see from here that 2 posts are leaning." "I'll look at it today," he said. "I'll come," she said. "It's cold," he said. "I live here," she said. He poured himself coffee. She turned back to the window and the mountain and the cold, clear morning coming in over the ridge that would, in another month or 6 weeks, bring the kind of winter that required everything you had. It would be hard. This mountain was always hard. He knew that going in, and she understood it now, having been through one full cycle, having seen what it asked of you and what it offered back. They would fix the fence. They would put up wood and check the stores and winterize everything that needed winterizing. They would argue about scarves and late mornings and the proper way to stack firewood, because they were 2 people sharing a life, and that was what 2 people did. Some nights would be harder than others. Some mornings the old weight would come back and settle, and the only thing to do on those mornings was what she'd said herself, get through until the next one. But the lamp was lit in the window now when darkness came. She slept until the sky showed light. The aspens outside the north window had gone gold and then brown, and their leaves were down and the branches were bare against the October sky, and next year they'd do it again, the whole long, patient cycle of a thing that knew how to survive winter because it had done it before and understood the basic principle. You go down to the roots, you hold on, and you come back when the season turns. Thorne finished his coffee. Evelyn was still at the window watching the mountain do what mountains did, which was stand there and endure and occasionally, in the right light, at the right hour, be genuinely beautiful. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said. They put their coats on. She checked his collar without making it a production, tucking it up against his neck against the cold. And he let her, because that was also something that had happened gradually and without announcement. This mutual tending, this small practical care. And they went out into the October morning together to fix what needed fixing. The mountain was waiting. It was always waiting. But for the first time in a long time, for both of them, the waiting felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. They walked out to meet it.
Damn, Zerty making that money, bro.
Yeah, I can't see in there, so I'm just deboing.
Bro's blind. For what, Mir? I'm confused. There we go. Chandler got the idea. Oh yeah, okay, that opens up everything. There's a fucking monster in there with them though. I don't think they've noticed it. It might be a snare flea. One of them might die. I don't know how to warn them about that. Oh no. Oh no, I think it's about to happen. Oh no, he's okay. He walked away. Cool. Alright, Zerti? Oh wait, I guess he just kept going.
They're still alive?
Mm-hmm. The whole map was closed behind a door.
Oh.
So now they can actually get to everything. Where's Chandler? Oh, he's just going where Ben already was. Wish there was a way to easily mark. Zerti?
Yeah.
Make sure no fucking jaguar sneaks up into this building, please.
Can they kill me if I'm on the roof?
I don't know. Oh wait, Ben's depoting. There's so many fucking mobs in that building.
What is that?
What is what?
It looks like either a bunch of insects or a big, like, snake.
Oh, it's a river. I thought the same thing when I saw that.
Oh.
It does look like that though, right?
Yeah, I thought it was a snake.
Oh. Chandler's being chased.
Uh-oh. Is he still inside?
Yeah.